Senate State Veteran Military Affairs Committee will come to order. Ms. Wallace, please call the roll.
Senator Hansen.
Here.
Senator Simpson.
Here.
Senator Sonnenberg.
I am here.
Senator Hawkes-Lewis.
Excused.
Mr. Chair.
Here, let's do this. We're hearing Senate Bill 224, 218, 135 for action only, Senate SCR 002, Senate Bill 206, House Bill 1054, Senate Bill 222, and Senate Bill 221. First up is Senate Bill 224, Protections for Donor-Conceived Persons and Families. And we have one of our sponsors here, but that is the President. Mr. President, would you like to tell us about your bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee. I know there are several folks, there's several bills today, so I'll try to keep this brief, but to be honest, this probably to most of you seems like a really random bill. So it probably does require a little bit of a preamble. And so I'm going to do that. I do have a couple of them, or actually just one amendment for now that I will pass out just so folks have it because it may influence. So, as I said, this probably is a topic that most of you, maybe none of you, have ever really thought about. And that's why I do want to provide a little bit of context. Using donor gametes, if you go back to 7th grade science class, we'll mostly refer to gametes, which is sperm and egg. Has its beginnings actually hundreds of years ago, and for the more rural folk on the committee, it's actually probably something you're quite familiar with in your on your ranches, and it has been when it comes to humans and not cattle, it has been a huge advancement for families. It has helped families. Do what they want to do, which is create that family, have kids, and do what most families dream of being able to do. Obviously, there are folks who are not able to conceive for a variety of reasons, whether it's infertility. It could be a woman who is unmarried but very much wants to have kids for whatever reason. This has been a medical advancement.
Oh, yeah.
We probably did need to lighten the mood. I thought talking about sperm was going to be fun, but some background music can help. This has been something that has helped millions of people. And it is not, today this bill, I want to make it clear, is not about demonizing an industry, demonizing the way people create their families. That is very much a sacred right and sacred thing that I think everybody should be able to enjoy and exercise. But to understand why this bill is here today, we need to go back in time a little bit to understand the process of using third-party gametes to conceive, how it came about, and most importantly, how it's evolved to get us to where we are today. So fertility doctors and clinics began using donor sperm primarily back then for helping people conceive really kind of more in a more mainstream way starting in the 70s and then in the 80s. And at this point, it was pretty low tech, and you can imagine kind of what that process was like. Not a ton of science involved, and it was a low tech thing that happened, and it largely was on a smaller scale. There was one aspect that was kind of universal, though, and I would say critical in the sense of how this practice became to be, and that was that everyone involved in the process was essentially promised something, and that thing they were promised was anonymity. The donor agreed to do this based on the promise that under no circumstance would anyone ever know that they donated their gametes. Their identity would never be known. That was the promise that was made to the donor. For the parents who desperately wanted to have a family and couldn't for whatever reason, They were told by their doctor to, after the procedure is done, to never speak of it again. We're gonna do this thing in this doctor's office, and then you're gonna go home. And our medical advice is that you never tell a soul. You don't tell your parents, you don't tell your friends, you don't tell your closest family. And part of this is based on shame around infertility. It is a sensitive topic, and it is something that I think back then was even more sensitive, especially when you're talking about, the way we portray masculinity in the media, etc. I don't want to get graphic, but to help explain how important it was to keep everyone sort of at arm's length from each other on the anonymity front. With the family, it used to be a very common practice to actually take the gametes from the husband and the gametes from the donor and mix them, and then do the procedure. And that helped the family, the parents, to sort of have plausible deniability. To go home and be like, the doctor said never tell a soul, and hopefully down the road we're going to get a positive pregnancy test. We're going to have a beautiful child. We're going to love him or her. And no one ever needs to know. And you know what? We don't even know. We don't know if this child is a miracle, something that just wasn't working for a while and then all of a sudden it did, or if it is because of that procedure that happened in that office. And that was how things went. It was largely something that was done. It was private, and it was never spoken of. But it was not as uncommon as I think we would think. The clinic involved in this also signed a contract with the donor, saying that they were contractually bound, so the clinic was contractually bound to the donor to never release the identity of the donor to the parents or to the resulting child. So you have a situation where everybody involved, in one way or another, either is told to never speak of it, or potentially even contractually bound to never speak of it. And to be honest, this probably wasn't, the end of the world in a lot of ways if you think about it. I mean, it was a complicated topic, and there was a donor that was doing something that was going to make a family happier than they've ever been. And there's a doctor who was helping that family do what they desperately wanted to do. And at the end of the day, that family had their beautiful child that they loved more than anything. But there are two problems, I guess, ramifications to this setup that has been in place for decades. There's one party that, of course, wasn't part of any of these agreements or contracts, and that's the child. And to an extent, that's okay when that person is a child. I think parental rights is something that we have discussed, I know in this committee several times, and it is important. This does not, I think it is appropriate to leave that decision to the parents if and when they talk to their child about their conception. But once that child becomes an adult, I think then it is their right to know more about themselves. And that's one of the issues with anonymity, is because it contractually obligates people to keep that secret from that adult once they turn 18. And then secondly, the practice of anonymity has also created what I would say is fertile ground for fraud. And I don't think everybody that is involved in this process by any means is guilty of anything. I don't think everybody is committing fraud. I think even at many times it is not fraud. It is potentially accidental or misrepresentation of some facts. But if you fast forward to today and you look at the sperm bank industry, that again sort of had its foundings back in the 70s and 80s, it is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are many websites, there are many companies, and it is a big industry. That low-tech process that I was discussing has advanced, and now the practice is actually to freeze the donations. And once you do that, and especially if you can get someone to agree to make donations multiple times a month for several years, and because it's frozen, the donations can be kept in perpetuity. A single donor now can have his gametes, and we're largely talking about sperm banks, but of course this includes egg banks as well, but it's a different process. That single person can have their gametes sold to hundreds of families. Hundreds of families. Not in Colorado, but hundreds of families all over the world. And that means that the fraud risk that I was talking about has actually compounded. Because here's how it works. The donor, especially these days, this is how it's evolved to work. The donor is essentially, they have a profile. It's like a dating profile. And then potential customers can search the profiles and pick who they want. The donor only continues to get paid if his profile is appealing, or if it seems like his profile would be appealing, and that people continue to pick him. Sometimes that donor might embellish a little bit. I think we have all heard of people embellishing on dating profiles, which is very counterintuitive because they meet that person. So when they say they're 6'2" and they very much are not, they're going to find out. But people even in that situation misrepresent themselves. In this case, when it is promised anonymity and contractually they say no one will ever know who you are. Oh, and by the way, these are the qualities that people generally like. So now fill out this profile about yourself. That person might not really be 6'2". They maybe didn't graduate from Harvard. They maybe don't play 5 instruments, and they maybe don't speak 4 languages. And if the profile keeps selling, the bank is clearly not incentivized to double check or verify some of that information. And again, I am painting what in some ways is a worst case scenario. By no means is this rampant, and are people just left and right saying they speak all these languages and they're selling like hotcakes on the website. But this does happen, and it is well documented. For decades, frankly, this all worked out fine for the sperm bank industry until another technological advancement came along. And it's called 23andMe or Ancestry.com, or you name the service. They're all very similar. And the way it works, I want to mention this because a lot of people, I think, who haven't done 23andMe or one of those services don't totally understand how it works. A lot of people think that if I don't spit in a tube and pay $100 to give my spit to somebody, then no one will ever have my DNA. No one will ever be able to find me on one of those websites. That is not how it works. The majority of people in this country can be found on these websites, even if you never participated in these websites. And that is because of how, of course, DNA works. If you have a cousin or an uncle or a distant cousin or a distant uncle who has done it, and I think we all probably do have a distant relative who has done one of these services, that means if someone wants to, they can probably trace things back to find you and where you fit in that person's family tree. It's just how genetics works. It's kind of like a math problem. That's how they found the Golden State Killer. He did not spit in a tube and send his DNA to the service, but it didn't matter because I think his niece did. So if you think about how rampant and how popular these services are, they're at the bottom of every Christmas tree these days, and they're given to people for Father's Day presents. Because it is so common now, these kids that have been conceived in this manner through these services are now finding out in the thousands that they may have been lied to, or maybe just weren't told all of the truth, or maybe the parents find out that they weren't told all of the truth about who that donor truly was. And these children, oftentimes adults now, are finding out that they have 50 or 100 or 500 half-siblings. I mean, you think about that for a minute. When your world is rocked, when you're very much an adult, maybe you have kids of your own, and you find out that where you came from is not what you thought it was. And not only that, But there are 500 people that are in the exact same situation as you, and you all share a genetic connection. The end result is deeply traumatic for everyone. And I will say it is deeply traumatic for a lot of the donors as well, because they went into this being promised anonymity, either 10, 15, 20 years ago, or today, when some people are going into a sperm bank and donating now. But anonymity is a thing of the past. It is not something anybody can promise when you are talking about DNA. DNA is literally the code to who you are as a unique person. In this day and age, you cannot expect that you give someone your DNA and that you will be anonymous, because it is the opposite of anonymous in today's day and age. So that's where this bill comes in. And here's what it does. At the core of it, it begins to remove what I would say is sort of that original sin. It removes not anonymity, it removes the promise of forever anonymity. A promise that, because of today's science, isn't a promise that actually anybody can keep. So, number one, what the bill does is it requires that when someone donates sperm or eggs, they are informed that if any children result from their donations, that the child will have the option to access that person's file once the child reaches the age of 18. They will specifically receive their name and the medical history that was disclosed when the donation happened, or if it was updated after the donation. When the kid turns 18, they have the ability to do what the vast majority of us take for granted, to find out their genetic background and their family medical history. It requires the sperm bank to make a good faith effort to track how many times a family uses a donor's gametes and successfully have a child, and charges the bank to make a good faith effort to limit that to 10 separate families. This is something that most Western democracies already implement, a family limit of some sort for these services. I want to note that it's important to recognize that this doesn't limit how many children can result, but how many families can be established. And what that means is that this bill would not take away the ability for a family that uses a donor's gametes to conceive and have a child. It would not limit them from using that same donor's gametes to have another child if it's important to them for their children to have a genetic connection. So the 10 family limit could mean 25 or so children, actually, as a limit. It also creates educational materials that are to be provided to donors, and separate materials to be provided to recipient families. And this isn't required counseling. This isn't intensive. These are just materials. These are papers. These are brochures. The materials are meant to ensure everyone understands the implications of being involved in one of these unique situations where you are creating a human through third-party assisted reproduction. It's purely educational. It also creates a minimum age of 21 for someone to be a donor, ensuring that they're mature enough to understand what they're getting themselves into, and to ensure that they have a more complete medical history that can be provided to the family when they're making a decision about which donor to choose. In the end, this bill does some simple things. If you're not comfortable with someone finding out who you are, don't give sperm. Don't donate your eggs. Because in today's day and age, you inherently are providing the keys to someone to find out who you are if you donate your DNA. That is what DNA is. If you're a person who was conceived using donor gametes, and there are a lot more out there than I think any of us know, then when you're an adult, you can make your own decision for yourself if you want to know more about your genetic background and your family or medical history. I want to say genetics is not everything. Many families are established and thrive without any sort of genetic connection. Adoption, LGBT families who use third party to help them conceive. It is not everything. Family means much more than just genetics. But identity is sort of everything. Everybody's identity is everything to them. It is important. And one's identity is the story of who we are and where we come from. And I think everybody should have a basic human right to know their own identity. That's what this bill is about. That's exactly why we already have a law that allows someone who was adopted to access their original birth certificate when they turn 18. It's essentially what this bill does, because that allows an adoptee to find out the missing pieces to their story once they turn 18, and it's their decision to make. People also have a right to not feel like a commodity. I think that's really important. And when you find out that you are one of 100 because of a profit motivation, I think that makes some people feel commoditized. At the end of the day, this bill is about families. It's about transparency. It's about honesty. And it recognizes that there is no such thing as anonymity when you're talking about DNA. So let's make that official so that everyone, the donor, the sperm bank, the parents, the child, all know exactly how things are going to happen, and everybody goes into it eyes wide open, knowing that people are going to find out who each other are. At the heart of it, third-party assisted reproduction is a series of legal contracts. The parties to that contract are the donor, the bank, and the parents. But I would argue the most impacted party isn't involved, and that's the child. So let's begin to recognize this, and that this is all about bringing life into this world, and that life should have the same rights as we all do, which is to know who they are and where they came from, their identity. There is an amendment that I passed out. It is largely cleanup. What it does is there was some leftover references to assisted reproductive technology in one of the headings and in the legislative declaration. That term, art or assisted reproductive technology, is actually not in the statutory law of the bill itself. And so I know there has been some concern that we are using an incorrect or inconsistent definition. I just want to clarify we aren't. We don't define art or assisted reproduction technology in the bill. And this removes any leftover references to it in the legislative declaration. The rest of this amendment, L001, is just fixing some grammatical errors. I want to thank Jane Ritter for her amazing work on drafting this bill. But in the 92 different drafts that we had along the way, there were some grammatical mistakes in the end that we still didn't catch. I'll leave it there. I have spent way too much time already, and I want to hear from the folks that are here to testify, but happy to answer questions before we get there.
Committee members, any questions for our sponsor? Seeing none, we'll get right into witness testimony. I have received a list of how folks or the sponsor would like to have testimony lined up. We'll do 4 folks at a time. And I'd like to call up Tyler Sniff, Christina Spencer. Is it Dov Fox?
Virtual.
Virtual, okay, online. Do we have Dov Fox online? Okay. And then last, Damian Adams, but also online. While we're waiting for those 2 online, we'll go ahead and begin with Mr. Sniff. Before that, I just want to just let you all know to set some ground rules. In State Veteran and Military Affairs Committee, we have 2-minute testimony. You will have a box that's here on the desk right by this computer. It's a green, yellow, and red light. Green is go, yellow means wrap up, red means please stop. You will also hear a beep for those of you who are online, and I will politely ask you to wrap up your comments. And I will ask you, Mr. Sniff, to make sure your mic is on. It is, and please state your name, tell us who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Honorable Chairman and committee members, my name is Tyler Sniff. I'm here on behalf of the U.S. Donor Conceived Council. I'm a practicing attorney. I'm also the volunteer for the council. An Ancestry.com test that my wife gifted to me for Christmas revealed that I am actually Jewish and that my wonderful dad is not my biological father. My biological father was an anonymous sperm donor who was a lifelong drug user and sadly died of an overdose at 36. He probably should not have been permitted to be a donor. Despite this, it was still very meaningful to me to learn about him as a person and his family medical history. As a result of this experience, I helped create the Donor Conceived Council, the only nonprofit in the United States founded and led by donor-conceived people there are likely more than 1 million donor-conceived people in the United States. This bill, as Senator Fenberg stated, would give adult DCP the unrestricted ability to obtain the identity of the donor similar to the rights of adult adoptees in Colorado. This is consistent with research and industry best practices. It only requires providing identifying and medical information. It does not require contact or a relationship to result between the parties. It will also let doctors tell their patients that the information they receive about donors is more likely to be reliable. The opposition will talk a lot about how sperm banks are complying with ASRM guidelines, that's the industry trade group, and that this bill will destroy the supply of donor gametes. This is false, as other witnesses will explain, but in short, because the ASRM does not control the sperm banks. Many donors and parents want these protections, and because there are banks and agencies that already meet or can step up their existing practices a bit to meet these standards. The core opposition refused to provide markup on this bill. But I am thrilled to say that the supporters of this bill include parents, an organization of egg donors, national gay and lesbian groups, a national sperm bank, one of the largest egg donor agencies in the country, and industry attorneys.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Please wrap up.
This is the first day in the history of the United States that donor-conceived people have been given a real voice. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony. Next up, Ms. Spencer, please state your name, tell us who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes. That's a little gray button next to the red light. There we go.
There we go. Hello. Okay, good. Good afternoon, Chairman Coleman and members of the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee. I'm Christina Spencer, and I live in Parker, just 20 miles south of here. In 2019, I accidentally discovered that my father and I share no DNA. I matched with a half-sibling on 23andMe and learned that I'm donor-conceived. I support Senate Bill 22224, the Donor-Conceived Persons and Families of Donor-Conceived Persons Protection Act. I was conceived and born at Rose Memorial Hospital here in Denver in the 1970s. I was raised in the Denver metro area by my mom and dad. I was raised as an only child. My mother was very happy to have me, but my father was rather disinterested. The more I achieved, the more my father seemed to resent me, and he actively tried to discourage me and put roadblocks in my way. I've had a mysterious neurological health issue for most of my life. When I got pregnant with my first child in 2007, it became hideous, and since then I have been in constant, miserable pain. For this health issue alone, I have now seen 65 doctors, had 6 major surgeries, 13 nerve blocks, another one coming this Thursday, and spent time at the Mayo Clinic. I took a DNA test for the health screening component to try and get a diagnosis. Instead, I found that half of my genes, come from a complete stranger who lives in a city I've never been to. Still in constant pain from this neurological problem, I wrote to this stranger, Mike, because I wanted to know if there were medical issues in his family that were diagnosed and if those answers could help me. I knew it was a big long shot, but I had to be honest with myself as well that I really wanted a relationship with this man. I'd never had a father who was proud of my accomplishments or who was warm and kind to me. Mike and I have now forged a terrific relationship. His presence in my life has filled a huge hole in my heart, and I have now seen photos of our ancestors. I knew who so many of my talents and abilities come from. Mike has told me that he was never asked any medical history, nothing at all, before he was asked to donate sperm. They knew his first and last name, and that was it. The half of me that is not from my mother is not a blank slate. It is not an empty set of generic genes. I might have been a lab experiment as a zygote, but I'm now a person. I have had to endure a lot because I had absolutely no idea that I did not share my father's DNA. My children have been affected by this secrecy as well. And were it not for my biological father's current empathy and kindness, my children and I would have no access to medical history. Knowing the truth of my origins and knowing my biological family has been immensely powerful.
Thank you. Please wrap up.
Please vote in support of Senate Bill 2024.
Thank you, Ms. Spencer. Appreciate it. Mr. Fox, thank you for joining us. Please state your name, tell us who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman and committee members, for this chance to testify in support of the proposed bill to protect donor-conceived persons and their families. My name is Dov Fox. I'm a law professor at the University of San Diego, where I direct its Center for Health Law Policy and Bioethics and write and teach about reproductive medicine and technology. This act would give families better information about half of a child's genes in ways that can meaningfully inform their personal identity and medical decisions. For a lot of people, it can be hard to tell your life story without knowing how it begins. And getting the kind of health care that you need can depend on having reliable information about certain biological risks that you carry. Sperm banks today in Colorado aren't required to run background checks, however, or test for hereditary disorders. They don't have to share any medical updates or any limits on how many kids can come from any one donor or any required reporting about what those numbers are. As the Senate President explained, ancestry websites reveal that popular donors today can have even up to hundreds of offspring. That many children from a single donor isn't just uncomfortable. It can be a medical liability. These kinds of stories show up in the medical journals every few years. A 2012 article in the Journal of Human Reproduction reports on a sperm donor who had a condition associated with brain tumors that he gave to at least 5 children. There's another account from 2009 in the Journal of American Medical Association about a donor with a heart disorder that he passed on to at least 8 kids, including a baby who died from cardiac failure. 3 years before that, in 2006, the Journal of Pediatrics chronicled a network of donor siblings who inherited a rare blood disease that can cause cancer and seizures. A recent case I looked into involved a young man down on his luck who saw the standard ad for an easy, anonymous way to make money, up to $15,000 a year. He provided samples to one of the world's biggest sperm banks for more than a decade without disclosing his risks of serious mental illness that were passed on to scores of his children.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. Please wrap up.
The risks posed by donor anonymity and the absence of offspring limits. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And last but not least, Mr. Adams, thanks for joining us. Please state your name. Tell us who you represent and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Hello, my name is Dr. Damian Adams. I've been conducting and publishing research on donor conception for over 10 years and medical science in general for over 25 years. I've been asked to testify today concerning my research which supports the Donor Conceived Persons Protection Act. Some have argued that this bill requiring donors to consent to the release of their identity to adult donor-conceived people will lead to a reduction in donor numbers. However, through my research, we saw here in Australia that sperm donor numbers increased up and anonymity was banned. This situation mirrored an increase in donor numbers in the United Kingdom when donors were also prohibited from remaining anonymous. Certainly some donors may choose not to donate, however the experience in Australia and the UK showed that with the appropriate recruitment strategies, donors could be recruited to more than cover those losses. We also conducted the first systematic reviews and meta-analysis of perinatal outcomes from donor conception. Donor-conceived babies fared worse in terms of being more likely to be born prematurely, low birth weight, and with increased incidence of birth defects. However, these outcomes were dependent on the treatment modality, with donor egg-conceived babies faring worse than donor sperm-conceived babies. These studies have been replicated by other authors who have found similar outcomes, thereby supporting our conclusions. These outcomes are significant because they fit within the developmental origins of health and disease phenomenon. This widely accepted scientific phenomenon describes that if you have a poorer start in life, such as being born prematurely and of low birth weight, you are more likely to develop heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity later in life. When we analysed adult donor sperm-conceived people to determine how their poorer start affected their long-term health, we found that they were more likely to have been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, thyroid disease, bronchitis, autism, attention deficit disorder, and to suffer a variety of other mental health conditions. Many of these outcomes have an inflammatory origin which is associated with the increased incidences of preeclampsia and pregnancy-induced hypertension that is observed in pregnancies achieved with donated gametes. I urge that in all considerations that the welfare of the donor-conceived person must be held as paramount and not subjugated to the desires of others. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Members, any questions for our panel? Seeing none, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you all. Our next panel, I'd like to call up Naomi Cahn, also Rachel Lemmons. I'd like to call up Diane Tober. And is there Romina Azuri? All right, we'll begin with Naomi. Ms. Cahn, thank you so much for joining us. Please tell us your name, tell us who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Senators. It's an honor to be here. My colleague Sonia Suter and I, who have submitted testimony, are honored to testify in support of this legislation. I am a law professor at the University of Virginia School of Law and the founding director of our Family Law Center. Sonia is a law professor at GW and a former genetic counselor. At the outset, I should note that this testimony is provided in our individual capacities only. We reference the law school where we teach for affiliation purposes only. These are our own views, but I should note that these are our own views developed after 25 years of teaching, writing about, and being active on issues addressed by this bill. There is a clear need and strong justification for this legislation. This legislation is both groundbreaking and a continuation of existing trends already in the United States. As is amply clear, there is an absence of adequate rules and laws regulating assisted reproductive technology. In fact, we don't even know the number of donor-conceived people in the U.S. or in Colorado, and as Senate President Fenberg noted, there are probably many more than we think. Other states are beginning to take action in this area, regulating the industry and protecting the interests of donor-conceived persons and their families. The state clearly has a rational, if not a compelling, interest in regulating the commercial industry of gamete and embryo banks and fertility clinics to protect the well-being of donor-conceived people, recipient parents, and donors. Other countries have moved in this area as well, banning anonymity, beginning with Sweden in 1985, and including Australia and the UK in 2005. They have also set limits on the numbers of families per donor. For example, in the UK, no more than 10 families can use the same donor. Of course, there is no limit on the number of children per family. The need for this legislation is clear, given that anonymity as a pragmatic matter can no longer be guaranteed. State regulation can help set out thoughtful rules that are responsive to various interests at stake. Second, and more fundamentally, donor-conceived people have interests that this legislation will protect. Finally, Colorado has an opportunity to provide fairness to donor-conceived people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Ms. Lemmons, please tell us your name, tell us who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Coleman and members of the committee. My name is Rachel Lemmons. I live in Denver, and I've been both an anonymous and known egg donor. On behalf of myself and We Are Egg Donors, which is a donor advocacy group of nearly 2,000 egg donors, we support Senate Bill 224. In the donor screening process, I was never educated on how my decision to donate would impact those born from my donations. I was told my obligations ended after egg retrieval. When I had my own daughter, I began to regret my anonymous donations. She's able to know where her DNA came from and her evolving family medical history. The children born from my donations deserve the same. My concerns about the impact to the lives I helped create were confirmed by speaking directly with donor-conceived persons. Many donors have the same experiences and concerns that I do. Had I known I may never be able to fulfill an ethical obligations to the lives I helped create, I would have never donated anonymously. The problem was that I was never educated on the impacts of being a donor or the challenges donor-conceived persons face. Donors cannot give informed consent when they're not informed. I urge you to support Senate Bill 224. In addition to the essential rights it would establish for donor-conceived persons, it would provide much-needed changes for egg donors. It contains provisions on materials to educate donors on the importance of open ID, which allows them to make an informed decision on if they should donate. It prioritizes the health of donors by creating a regulatory limit on the number of cycles egg donors can complete. It also places reasonable limits on the network of half-siblings, which benefits donors, their family, and children. The truth is that our obligations don't end after egg retrieval. When you deliberately help create life, those obligations last a lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Next up, Dr. Tober, please state your name, tell us who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Coleman and members of the committee. My name is Dr. Diane Tober. I'm a medical anthropologist and associate professor at the University of Alabama and affiliate faculty at University of California, San Francisco. I've been working on issues related to donor conception for almost 30 years, and I'm here to speak in support of Bill 22224. My testimony today is based on results from my data of over 300 egg donor interviews and 700 surveys funded in part by the National Science Foundation. Most participants in my egg donation study were in their early to mid-20s at first donation, with some as young as 18. Most donated eggs out of financial need, with over half reporting incomes below or slightly above the federal poverty level, accompanied by high student loan debt. The ASRM recommends egg donors undergo no more than 6 cycles due to both concerns about consanguinity and potential risks for donors. Yet many egg donors reported undergoing between 7 and as high as 19 cycles, far exceeding those guidelines. According to the Institute of Medicine report, a cycle should be canceled when a donor produces more than 20 eggs. Yet in my study, donors frequently report over 30 and as high as 83 eggs per cycle, which directly affects the number of children that can be born per donor. Such cycles are strongly associated with increased risk to the donor, especially of a life-threatening condition known as ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Donors who experience severe OHSS in a prior cycle are at 35% increased risk of developing the condition on a subsequent cycle. Limiting the number of cycles and live births per donor can help reduce the egg donor exposure to risk and ameliorate consanguinity concerns. Finally, in my analysis of donor desires for anonymity versus open donation, 63% preferred open identity option from the outset, 20% were undecided, and only 17% preferred anonymity, something which is no longer possible. Over half of the donors surveyed expressed a desire to someday meet the people born from their eggs, and 20% had attempted to find them through ancestry testing and other means. I support this bill because it is a step in the right direction for protecting the rights of both donor-conceived people and donors, and I urge your support as well. Thank you,
Dr. Tober. And last but not least, I have Romina Azuri, but it looks like it's Romina Slossberg on the screen. Please tell us your name, tell us who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Coleman and members of the committee. My name is Romina Slossberg. And in 2017, my wife and I purchased what we thought was the perfect donor with a perfect, clean medical record. In 2019, my daughter was born with microtia, smaller ear, and moderate to severe hearing loss on the right ear. In 2021, we found a donor sibling with a missing limb. Later that year, and after talking to my daughter's doctors, we decided to look for a donor in hopes of seeking out medical answers we so desired. We found him through DNA testing in October of 2021. A close member of his family had the same condition as my daughter. In addition to learning this, we also found out that there was death due to cancer in his family, as well as some other issues. So we were sold the perfect donor. After conducting my own research, I was able to find out that donor medical records are self-reported and not verified by the bank. There are also not updated at any point throughout the years. And I not only support this bill because of the right my kids have to know, to have full access to unupdated medical history at any point in life if needed, but because they also have the right to know where they come from, to have a relationship with their biological family. Since finding our donor, my kid's biological father, he has been fully active in their life, and so have the rest of his family. It has been nothing but beneficial to all parties involved. Donor-conceived people deserve the right to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Slossberg. Committee members, any questions for this panel? Seeing none, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate your testimony. I've been asked by the sponsors to switch to opposition. I do have 7 folks signed up against and 1 for amend. I will do once again this calling of 4 for a panel. So let's begin with John Hudson, Ellen Trachman, Judith, and I'm going to butcher your name. Is it Hoescth? Forgive me. And then also Betsy, Cairo. And we'll begin. I'll let you all get situated. All right, first on the list I have Mr. John Hudson. Thank you for being here. Make sure that gray button by the red light on the desk, there we go. Push that gray button so your mic is on. Perfect. Okay. Please tell us your name, tell us who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. This is my first time to testify ever in the legislature, so give it my best shot here. But I decided to testify this morning because I do feel strongly about this issue. I am a Colorado attorney licensed since 1972. I went to DU Law School. My law practice since 2002 is largely focused on assisted reproductive technology. I've largely done egg donation agreements, represented both intended parents and egg donors. Most of these contracts have been anonymous. I will say maybe 5% have been open agreements or known agreements where the parties know each other. I've not had any difficulties with all the parties I've represented since 2002 with coming to me with issues regarding wanting to be connected with donor-conceived people wanting to be connected to their donors. The contracts I work on, we have mechanisms in these contracts for the parties to connect with each other if there is a problem. So my testimony largely relates to egg donation agreements, not sperm donation. The sperm donation agreements I've done have all been known, so I can't really speak to the issue of problematic issues regarding sperm banks. I've worked with art agencies who manage these contracts and their retrieval procedures. I've always made myself available, as have these agencies, to promote future contact between donors and intended parents. As I said, since 2002, I've not had one intended parent or donor-conceived child contact me about the need for the donor-conceived children to communicate with their donors. I am certainly aware that from ASRM and my practice generally that donor-conceived persons often wish to have contact with their gamete donors.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Please wrap up.
I am opposed to the current version of the bill. I feel it's been rushed and we need more time. I am in support of the rights of donor-conceived children, donor-conceived people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Is it Trachman? Trachman. Thank you so much for joining us. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Ellen Trachman, and I am testifying on behalf of Colorado Fertility Advocates, a nonprofit advocacy group dedicated to supporting Colorado families and individuals facing fertility challenges. Colorado Fertility Advocates is made up of a board and membership that includes Colorado fertility doctors, mental health professionals, lawyers, parents, donors, and advocates. Although we are generally on the same side with the sponsors of this bill, we respectfully ask for a no vote on SB 22-224 today as it is written. In the past, our members have worked closely with the sponsors of this bill. They deserve to be commended for their strong work on behalf of Colorado families. However, this bill before us today, in its current form, unfortunately threatens to undo some of the progress we've made in our state. To be clear, the bill is the first of its kind in the United States. Never before has a bill like this been introduced in any American state. There is no domestic blueprint, only models from countries where a national mandated registry for all donors and offspring is the norm. Colorado Fertility Advocates agrees with the overall goals of the bill and supports the need for greater protections for donor-conceived persons. Unfortunately, the Colorado experts in this field have not had the time and opportunity to provide collaborative and substantive feedback necessary to prevent a well-intentioned bill from doing more harm than good. The bill requires significant revisions, additional collaboration, and more development to correct definitions inconsistent with other state and federal laws, to prevent tensions and contradictions with privacy and equal protection laws, to develop standards and expectations for realistic implementation, and to understand and ensure reasonableness in processes and costs. It's a heavy lift, and will take all of us working intentionally and carefully. We look forward to further working with the sponsors to develop the bill language to meet those same important goals of protection for donor-conceived persons and families, but without the unintended consequences overshadowing the good. We ask for your no vote today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And is it starts with an H? Who is it? Hoescth. Come on. Thank you so much for joining us. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You have 2 minutes.
Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the committee, my name is Judith Hoescth, and I'm testifying in my capacity as an assisted reproduction and family formation attorney in Colorado. I'm a member of a number of assisted reproductive technology legal professional associations in the United States, along with my colleagues, and I'm a producer of legal education for attorneys in the specialized area of the law for the American Bar Association, the Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproduction Attorneys, and the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. I'm the immediate past chair of Colorado Fertility Advocates, Colorado's nonprofit advocacy group dedicated to supporting Colorado families. And for the past year, I've been secretary of the Board of SEEDS, the Society for Ethics in Egg Donation and Surrogacy. This work is important to my being, as my husband and I had our family through assisted reproduction. My colleagues and I have supported every assisted reproductive legislative bill in Colorado since 2019, even drafting the language of these bills. We worked with Resolve and ASRM in support of these bills. However, it should not be taken lightly that none of my Colorado attorney colleagues are mental health care providers providers, fertility clinics, gamete agencies, Resolve, or ASRM support SB 22-224 in its current form. An amendment or amendments will not fix this bill. On a daily basis, I and my many assisted reproductive colleagues are united to protect gamete donors, recipients of donation who are blessed to have families through donation, and the children born through donation of gametes. I respectfully ask for a no vote on SB 22-224 as it is written. There are constitutional law protections that are violated by this bill. The first of these is a privacy right protection under the 14th Amendment. Under the 14th Amendment privacy protections, parents are deemed to make decisions regarding the best interests of their children. Parents already make these decisions with their attorneys regarding contact and the various means of contact with their gamete donors. There are equal protection violations in this bill. Third, federal law, specifically HIPAA protections for every individual's personal medical information, is in conflict with this bill. The issue becomes this: is there any reason to rush a bill of this magnitude through the legislature without considering the significant effects and overreach of this bill, and without requiring fair representation of stakeholder interests that have not been represented so far?
Thank you. Please wrap up.
Thank you. Last of all, after representing thousands of assisted reproductive clients over the years of my practice, not one client has returned to ask if I can help them find their gamete donor. I'm not opposed to this bill. I'm opposed to this bill as written. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you for your testimony. And last but not least, Ms. Cairo, thank you for joining us. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and all committee members. My name is Betsy Cairo. I own the only commercial cryobank in Colorado called Cryogam. Cryogam has been operating since 1990. I am the founder and the director. I have my doctorate in human reproduction, and I am a board-certified reproductive biologist as a high-complexity laboratory director. With over 35 years of experience, I've seen many advances, both medically and politically, in the field of reproductive medicine. FDA is one of those political and medical advancements. The focus of FDA was to bring in processing, testing, screening, and distributing of donor tissue to make for a safer tissue. This can either be done anonymously or by a known donor. This bill differs in FDA's definition. During the course of my years of experience, I've had a total of 7 requests from donor-conceived people to make contact with their genetic donor. As evidenced by the low number of donor-conceived people that have contacted our bank, this broad-stroke approach to this bill forces us to solve a problem that is already covered with other programs such as Donor Sibling Registry, where the donors and donor-conceived people can connect by choice. My main points of concerns are cost. This bill does not outline full cost or implementation. It does indicate the burden of cost will be on the medical community and the state. Number 2, the loss of donor population. You've heard that this isn't a problem. I can tell you firsthand it is. 3, protection of the donor. This bill is one-sided. There is no protection for the donor. The donor has zero input or say of what happens to their future. The recipient or donor-conceived person will have full access to all donor information without any obligation to keep the information private, including their place of residence. What will stop a donor from being shared on social media, even if they have denied contact? Proof of being genetically linked. This is extremely problematic. This bill does not address the issue of proof of genetic linking. If a donor-conceived person is requesting identity and all identifying information without proving that this was their genetic donor, imagine the fallout of giving out information on a donor that proves to not be genetically linked to the donor-conceived person requesting it. A paper trail is not good enough. And the risk of increase in abandoned tissue, in particular embryos. This bill will not allow embryos to be donated if 10 families have been formed. This bill, as written, is unsupportable, but I do want to participate in further discussion regarding this topic. For all these reasons, I urge you to vote no on SB 22-224.
Thank you for your testimony. Any questions for this panel? Senator Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I wanted to start with a question for Ms. Trachman about the objection you raised around definitions. And I wondered, do you have suggestions for us today that we should consider and how you might want to amend the bill and the definitions in the bill?
Ms. Trachman. And let's make sure your mic is on again. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Senator Hansen. So one of the problems in the definition right now, it seems to be trying to work in the language of the statute without being consistent with other laws. I haven't seen the amendment, but one example I know in the current bill is it defines gamete banks and fertility clinics together and says that those are entities that use unknown tissue. Well, the common usage of fertility clinic doesn't necessarily mean that they would be using unknown tissue. They certainly could be a fertility clinic without using unknown tissue. I just feel like for those where it's inconsistent with other definitions in federal law, state law, we need to be more careful on those definitions.
Any further questions? Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Trachman, but why does it matter? Because the definition is only for this act. It doesn't impact any other law. So why does it matter that the reason why the definition is written that way is to be narrowly tailored? So would you rather us make it broader and apply to more gamete banks?
Ms. Trachman.
You see what I'm saying?
Ms. Trachman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Senator Fenberg. I think the problem is that law, when you have a definition in statute, it can be taken out of context of that statute. So I think a clearer way when it comes to definition is to clearly define what a fertility clinic means and then separately clearly say this applies only to unknown donor gamete tissue. So I think there's a way to clearly say what you want to say without confusing the definitions.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I totally understand where you're coming from if it's a layman who is just interpreting a statute and has never read statute before. But the reason why we put a definition is to make sure it's clear what we're talking about. And there are many bills that will say the definition for this section of local government, which is a pretty well-known, just general term, and it will define it to mean cities but not counties. But counties are local governments in the real world, just not for that section of law. And that's pretty normal. It's in almost every act in our state code. So what is the negative ramification when that's what we do for almost every definition within statutes?
Ms. Trachman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Senator Fenberg. I think the confusion comes from attorneys that aren't as familiar with legislative practices who then use definitions from other laws for whatever purpose it may be and add to the confusion. It just seems like there's a much easier and clearer way to be consistent with other laws and also say what you mean.
Any further questions?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Ms. Cairo, if you don't mind. So since you have a facility that we're basically talking about, do you currently have a family limit right now? I was actually astounded when I heard some of the story that President Fenberg talked about, where folks had been identified with like hundreds of family members, and I can't imagine what they must be going through to try to figure that out. So do you, in your everyday practice, have a family limit?
Ms. Cairo.
Thank you. We do have a family limit. What is important to understand here is that cryobanks are not the rate limiting step with respect to recording pregnancies. With every order that we send out or that a patient picks up, there is a pregnancy report form that is put into each order that we request to be returned in the event of a pregnancy. We don't require live birth reporting, but we would prefer if we could get that. We sometimes get the reports back, we sometimes don't. Most often, we don't. At one point historically, I wanted to do follow-up on my donors and sent out letters to everybody. This is before email and all the electronic things, and actually sent out letters and received several angry phone calls and letters in response that this was none of my business, it's a private matter, and I had no right to this information.
So if you don't mind, because we have a lot of people to get through, I'm going to, Mr.
Please dialogue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to try to keep this very focused.
Okay.
So, and let's stay with email time frame and internet time frame, if you don't mind. So if you say that you're using a form, and some people bring it back, some people don't, it sounds like you're not really enforcing a limit, because if they can just not send the form back in, you're not really keeping track of a family limit.
I guess I'll have to. I guess I have to answer that with a question. I'm not exactly sure how I can enforce a person to give me that information or a clinic to give me that information. We do call clinics, we do try with follow-up, but I don't know how I can force another person to give me information.
Mr. Chair, I'll do one more if that's okay, Mr. Chair. So we've heard a little bit about the recommended guidelines from the ASRM. Do you follow those guidelines as a typical everyday procedure? And if not, why not?
Can you give me a specific guideline you're referring to? Because there are several.
Well, you're probably asking me the wrong one, asking me meet the because I'm a pharmacist, and so there are all these guidelines every time I fill a prescription, and I have to follow every one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm asking you, since they're guidelines for your business, do you follow them?
We do follow the ASRM, the ATB. We are also a member of the AAB, and also we are regulated, inspected, and monitored by the FDA. And so all of those guidelines we are also licensed in other states, and we have to follow their guidelines. So there are actually, when we're licensed, it's legislation. So we have to follow their rules. So there are a lot of things that we follow. Yes.
Okay. And last but not least, Mr. Chair, if that's all right. So we're looking. This legislation is proposing an age of 21. Is that something you can enforce if we pass this to be 21? Can you enforce that, and will you be able to enforce it? Because it wouldn't be able to be it can't be like a paper form that somebody doesn't fill out and then you just let them donate or whatever. I mean, it has to be enforceable if we pass this law.
So all of our donors are required to submit a legal government document, whether it's a passport or a driver's license. Now, they could forge those documents, and I don't know how to test that, but we do ask that. So those are on file with us. With respect to enforcing the age of 21, that is not a problem if I have their legal document that states their age. We are the only sperm bank that has always limited the age of our donors to not more than 35 as well.
Seeing no further questions for this panel, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate you. And then we will call up one more panel with folks in opposition and one amend. I'd like to call up Emily McArthur. Laura, is it Koupal or Koupal? Also, Dr. Cassandra, is it Rocha or Recca? I mean, I am just butchering these names today. I apologize, y'all. Rocha? Okay. And then also in the position of amend was Miss Deb Roberts. Okay, we'll begin with Miss Rocha. Dr. Rocha, thank you for joining us. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, my name is Dr. Cassandra Rocha, and I'm testifying in my capacity as a member of Colorado Fertility Advocates, a nonprofit organization composed of professionals dedicated to helping Coloradans facing fertility struggles build their families. While the protection of donor-conceived people is an important clinical and research interest of mine, this bill in its current state misses the mark, and I ask for consideration of a no vote on SB 22-224 today. I've worked with sponsors of this bill to help pass some of the most expansive fertility coverage for Coloradans to date with the recent passage and implementation of the Colorado Building Families Act. Important stakeholders, including national fertility organizations, Colorado American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, Division of Insurance, clinics, physicians, and patients were included to design a bill that took into account a multitude of considerations. However, the bill before you today is far from that, and in its current state, national organizations, including the American Society of Reproductive Medicine and Resolve, Colorado fertility clinics, and patients have spoken out against the passage of this bill. This is not to say that the goal to protect donor-conceived people is not important and in need of action, but the speed with which this bill is presented has left many voices behind and will ultimately limit access to fertility services for many in Colorado in its current form. As a state, we should be interested in socially responsible reproductive medicine practices, but that involves giving stakeholders appropriate time and a seat at the table to avoid passage of a bill that will cause undue burden and severely limit a long-held legitimate medical practice. I also have concerns this bill includes recommendations driven neither by evidence-based practice nor expert opinion. I look forward to working with the sponsors, banks, clinics, and the donor-conceived community to create a bill with language that will reflect the important protections this bill intends to seek. But in its current form, I respectfully ask that you vote no today. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. And then Ms. McArthur, thank you for joining us. Tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes. Oh, and yep, hit the gray button. You got it.
Okay. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Emily McArthur, and I'm here to testify in opposition of SB 22-224. While I do believe that a bill is needed to help address an area of law that supports the balance of interests of donor-conceived persons and recipient parents, as an assisted reproductive technology attorney, I cannot support the bill in its current form. I wholeheartedly support protections for donor-conceived persons. In my 17 years of practicing in this field, I have represented both donors and recipients, the majority actually being donors. I believe this bill will have a chilling effect on the number of donors willing to help build families in Colorado. Donors will instead use out-of-state fertility clinics and donate to recipients located in other states. This will take away one of the best options for Colorado recipients to grow their families. The current bill proposes that states outside of Colorado must comply with the mandates therein, including providing written materials to donors and recipients. I don't know how Colorado can enforce this. This mandate will severely limit the number of donors available to Colorado families and place an undue burden on out-of-state clinics. Colorado fertility clinics and gamete banks adhere to the guidelines of the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, which is a worldwide organization with over 100 member countries. Attorneys practicing in this field draft donor contracts using the same guidelines. The ASRM guidelines already incorporate much of what this bill proposes. I represent intra-family donors, but I also represent donors who wish to remain unidentified. These donors are giving a unique gift. They comply with agency and fertility clinic requests for a complete medical history. They agree to update the agency and/or fertility clinic if their health situation changes. ASRM guidelines state that the best practice is that a donor's testing results be kept on record indefinitely. And the world-class Colorado fertility clinics that I work with keep records of the results of a donation. They give donors the option to permit contact.
Please wrap up.
Okay. There's also an equal protection argument, as this law puts an arbitrary and unfair limit on a woman's right to donate gametes while not imposing the same limitation on a sperm donor. I believe this bill has great potential. I just think we need to take time to get it right.
Thank you for your testimony. Laura, please help me with your last name. Koupal. Miss Koupal, thank you for joining us. Here we go. Yep. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name's Laura Koupal. I'm testifying today as a Colorado resident, and I'm a fertility attorney. I have over 17 years of experience in fertility law. I've represented over probably 1,300 clients who are both recipients, donors, surrogates, and recipient parents. While I very much agree that the interests of donor-conceived persons and their parents should be protected, I respectfully ask for a no vote today as the bill is currently written. I think when we started this conversation today with the senator, it was presented as though gamete donation is a novel concept without prior rules or regulations. I agree with what Emily said about the regulations that we do currently have in place. This isn't an urgent or immediate need. It needs to be a thoughtful process that Colorado can actually comply with, and that doesn't conflict with the other states. Sperm donation has been around since 1884. We've had sperm donor clinics since the 70s. Some of the facts that are thrown about today are, I would consider to be somewhat conjecture, hearsay, out of the ordinary, speculative, on the cover of People magazine stories. That's not our day-to-day experience in dealing with donors and represented parents. I'm not going to go through all of the rules and regulations that Emily just mentioned through the ASRM and the FDA requirements, but if there's specific questions on what those rules are, we can certainly circle back to that. All that said, I wholeheartedly agree that the interests of donor-conceived persons should be protected. I agree that there should be more clear laws. We work in our internal organizations through the Academy of Assisted Reproductive Technology attorneys to try to spearhead more regulation. But, you know, this law is not it. It needs to have more stakeholders, more fertility physicians need to be included, and gamete agencies as well. I think it would be really hard to enforce, and I think it places an undue burden on the Department of Health and Environment, and I don't know what the cost associated with that would be.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Last but not least, Ms. Roberts, please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to the committee for your thoughtful consideration of this complex matter. I'm Deb Roberts, mom of 2 amazing children, conceived via embryo donation and founder of Embryo Connections, an embryo donation concierge. We partner with clinics, egg donor agencies, and sperm banks to ensure properly informed embryo donations, and recently won a federal grant to support it for 5 years. We're solving for the 1.6 million embryos plus in storage and proud to be based in Colorado. I'm asking to adjust the language that has made well-intentioned ideas largely restrict embryo donation and or render following the guidelines unrealistic for donation of the embryos already created. To be clear, over 85% of our donors seek an open relationship. The issue is that upwards of 40% of embryo donors used donor egg or sperm. They are eternally grateful to their gamete donors and want to pay it forward to another struggling to have a child. I propose two changes to ensure that all embryos already created may be donated to other families regardless of the number of families who use the gamete donor or to the openness of that gamete donor. One is eliminating the 10-family limit for embryo donation. My loves, who are the product of a triple donation, donor egg, sperm, and then donated embryo to me, have more than 10 related families. I'm connected to 9 of them already. By this bill, my children would not have qualified to exist. Donor-conceived embryos give hope to so many struggling fertility patients. Disallowing embryo donation of the best quality embryos also increases the financial and emotional burden to fertility patients and to Colorado companies because it will instead attempt an egg donor cycle and or multiple cycles versus embryo donation, which is far easier and more less expensive. It will also reduce embryo donation by 40%. While agencies and sperm banks do request live birth information, as was discussed earlier, it's voluntary, so data inaccuracy is rampant, and so the limitation is based on false data. The second is eliminate restrictions.
Thank you. Please wrap up.
On closed gamete donation for embryo donation. For the same reason, embryo donations can't be held to rewrite prior egg and sperm donor agreements. Instead, it will simply reduce the embryo donations. So in summary, I ask to remove the family limit and close limitations for the purposes of embryo donation, which is not clear in the bill.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts. Committee members, any questions for this panel? Senator Sonnenberg.
I'm not sure this is a question, but it's nice to have finally some specific language, and I'd be interested in hearing the sponsor's response as well to the comments with the specific language. Is that opposite what we want to do? Is that a potential help here? Because I think the rest of them, even though they didn't specifically ask that question or give us that language, may fall into that same category that we're trying to talk about here.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Sonnenberg. So, agreed. Ms. Roberts, I got your email, I think, last night, and I started replying to it, and then I fell asleep. But I would love to continue the conversation on this because it did raise some issues that started to make me scratch my head. So I don't have an amendment to address this today, but it's something that I would love to continue talking with you about to make sure there's clarity. But with that said, my understanding is the way the bill is written now is the family limit doesn't apply to embryos. It applies to donation of gametes that may then create an embryo, but it does not apply to the embryos. And so there may be some clarity that needs to happen, and 100% fine with that, and it's very nice to get concrete feedback. So we can work on language if needed. But my understanding is that it does not apply to embryos. And then secondly, I think it's important for this entire conversation to recognize that the bill only applies to donations of gametes made after 2024. So if a sperm donor donates a few years ago and it's later used, the bill does not apply to that donation. So it is only forward-looking, and it from 2024 on. And I don't think it applies to embryos. And if there needs to be clarity to make sure the right pieces apply and right pieces don't apply, happy to have that conversation, figure that out with language. I think the other thing that's important to know is because of that effective date trigger in 2024 and all donations made before that don't apply to this bill, there is a lot of inventory, if you will, that's out there that Colorado families will still be able to use, and these protections will not be in place. I don't love that because I think the bill is good and it should apply to everybody, but that there is a natural phase-in period that will allow the industry, I think, to sort of change, and I think the change is already starting to happen. But I just want to clarify that it's not like overnight in 2024 this bill applies to all gametes. It's only for donations made after that effective date. But the embryo thing, I think we can clarify if it's not clear in the bill.
Any additional questions? Seeing none. Oh, Senator Hansen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to pick up on that last point because it feels like there are, and I'm going to guess Western European countries that have a number of provisions that are similar to what we're talking about today. And I'm wondering kind of how our discussion today fits into sort of the international laws, how our local banks or how U.S. Banks interact with those international laws.
Who would like to take that question? Ms. Koupal?
Sure. I don't have a list in front of me of what every country does, but for example, European countries, there are some countries that don't allow any donations, don't allow surrogacy, and the citizens of those countries tend to travel to the U.S. for fertility services. There are certain countries that do allow for donations, whether they're known or anonymous. ASRM as a governing body also has, like Emily said, 100 other countries that participate in issuing their guidelines. So it's a collaborative effect. But I think that's part of our issue overall with the bill is I think we need to provide more research. Like how can Colorado be collaborative with the rest of our own 50 states, with European countries or other countries that we want to collaborate with so that we're not sort of sitting on our own island trying to force the Department of Health and Environment to regulate all of these incoming gametes.
Any other questions? Mr. President?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to circle back on the ASRM guidelines for a minute. It's been said, and I've seen this in other publications, and it's not the first time I've heard that a law is unnecessary because the ASRM guidelines already covers this and then a whole lot more. And I agree, the ASRM covers most of this and a whole lot more. I guess my disagreement or question is, does anyone follow the ASRM guidelines when it's a sperm bank?
So,
and my understanding is that, and I'll tell you why I've come to this understanding, is that they are guidelines and they are used as a way to say this is what everybody should do. This is best practice. A whole bunch of smart lawyers, ethicists, medical professionals, et cetera, have come together to put together these guidelines. But I don't think any sperm bank in America follows those guidelines precisely. Some do it better than others. Some do it very poorly. And I know this, and I guess I don't know it. I have this opinion because when I first started drafting this bill, I essentially took ASRM's guidelines and put it into a bill. And I shopped it around. And I know people said that they've never seen me in their lives or whatever. We've never talked and there's no stakeholding. But we've been talking since January to a lot of folks. And I provided that first draft, and a lot of people said, including sperm banks around the country, said, man, this would make it impossible. We go out of business. I went line by line. I talked to a lot of attorneys, et cetera, to say, okay, well, so you can't do this. This is impossible. And they're like, yeah, we can't do that. That's not practical. I said, well, on page 17 of ASRM guidelines, you're supposed to already be doing that. And I did that dozens of times on the frickin' guidelines, and they don't follow them. There are age requirements in these guidelines. There is a requirement, or, it's a guideline, so it's not a requirement, they can't enforce it, that says that you have to go to psychological counseling to become a donor or a recipient. That you have to be given psychoeducational information, that there is a limit on egg retrieval cycles to 6, that there has to be genetic testing, that you have to go 3 generations back in medical history. These are all things that I was told nobody can comply with that. That is crazy. But they are the ASRM guidelines. I didn't make them up. I don't know this stuff that well that I could have made up these guidelines myself and put them into a bill. They're based on your industry's guidelines that you are saying is why we don't need regulation. So my question is anybody following these guidelines, and how do you know? Because I worked with others and we surveyed every sperm bank in the country. And I have a spreadsheet that tells me which guideline they follow and which one they don't, based on their website.
So,
Can I speak to that?
absolutely. So who all would like to speak? Everybody. All right. So we'll start off with Ms. Koupal, please.
So I think you brought up a really great point, and this is what Ellen Trachman was talking with you about. A cryobank can have any kind of tissue in it, including gametes or human tissue. A fertility clinic is a completely different organization. And so when you look at what organizations are following ASRM guidelines, I can't speak to this for sure, but I know that the fertility clinics are probably more compliant with ASRM guidelines than the cryobanks, and that's my opinion. That's not fact. But so that's why words matter, and that's one of the issue that we have with the bill. So that's something you could rework. You could say, we want compliance with ASRM guidelines, and that, that would be a bill that we would support, or I would support. But when you're talking about the specifics of how you're going to force compliance, then I think we just need to look more specifically at that. But again, I think the definitions and the words are really important.
So I want to let the folks respond, and then we'll go back to the president. Ms. Roberts, please.
So a couple of things that I just wanted to answer the question that was asked earlier related to this, which is that sperm banks are limiting the number of families that can receive the number of families because we do embryo donation, and therefore we have to be in touch. We're in touch with all egg agencies and cryobanks, and I can tell you that we've called them and they've said, no, you cannot donate these embryos because that sperm donor has expired. So they cannot go to another family, that they've exceeded the number of families that can receive that sperm donor's sperm. So I can give you two examples of that. One is Zytex, which actually says you can only use them for your own family, and that's actually written into their own contract with their recipients. And the second is Fairfax Cryobank, which we have to contact every time we use one of their, we donate from their sperm. We have to contact them to ensure that we can donate the embryos. So those are just two, but we're obviously they're doing their best to catch up to the guidelines, is what I would tell you related to that. But it gets back to the point of the clarity of the language, right? Because those sperm banks are saying an embryo donation is considered another family.
Ms. McArthur.
Thank you. And I would add to that obviously what Laura said is true. We don't necessarily oppose codifying the ASRM guidelines. I do not think that's a bad idea. I think it's a good idea. Personally, in working with sperm donors, I would say 99.9% of them are all known donors. So I don't actually deal with sperm banks. So when you have a known donor situation, that throws a whole different set of criteria in there. And so when drafting our contracts, we have to adhere to those ASRM guidelines. We do put that in there. So just extraneous input.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize to the panel, but I just want to respond to a couple of those things, and maybe I'll throw a question in there, so I'm following the rules. The first version of the bill, or maybe it was the third version, basically said that sperm banks should be licensed, and the rulemaking to create these minimum standards should be based on ASRM guidelines. Massive pushback. And that's what led me to the conversations that made me conclude that people don't follow these guidelines. And I don't know about everybody, but I'm talking about sperm banks in this situation. And so if you're telling me right now that you would support a bill that codifies ASRM guidelines to apply to sperm banks, I think Betsy's head would explode. Okay, I apologize. I'm just saying, I apologize, Betsy.
Hold on, y'all. We need to get order to this committee. I want to make sure that we're respectful of the folks in the audience and also respectful of the panel. And if anyone's talking, it's only because they've been called on. So we want to make sure we're respectful. And I'll give it back to the president, and then we need to wrap this panel up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and apologies for that. But I guess to clarify, and I was being a little glib there, but the age limits aren't followed the age guidelines are not followed in American sperm banks. So if you codify that, all of a sudden they have to change their practice. They don't follow that. The family limits, it is the one thing that ASRM guidelines, I think, are woefully inadequate. And it is like you can have 25 children for every 800,000 people or something like that. That is like 400 children in New York from one donor is what that standard would mean. Nobody thinks that's reasonable, I don't think. And that is what their current standard is. So yes, they are probably following that standard, that guideline, but it's woefully inadequate. The other pieces is on psychological evaluation of donors, not followed. Some clinics do some of these things, but they charge more for it as a premium. But vast majority of them don't do any of these things that we're talking about right now. Sperm banks, that is. And if there are limits for some of these sperm banks, and they're saying you can't do more than X, Y, or Z, it's because of a contractual obligation that they may have, but it's not because they're following ASRM guidelines. That's my understanding. The thing around definitions, more than happy to look at the definitions and figure out if there are changes that need to be made. But the definition is crafted in the way to intentionally not apply to a fertility bank that doesn't do the things that are in this bill. But some do. So it would be difficult for every section of this bill to say fertility banks that do the following. So instead we cut to the chase and had a definition and say this is only about fertility banks that do X, Y, and Z. So we could use that term throughout. So that's why the definition is what it is. And I think it actually results in fewer fertility banks being regulated by this act because of it. So it was done intentionally. The last thing I just wanted to mention is that this bill does not apply to known donors. So I agree with you, and I think known donations are a whole different ballgame.
Absolutely.
And this bill doesn't touch them. And so I just wanted to clarify, this is pretty narrow, actually. It's only for facilities that actually do the things that the bill is discussing. It is only after a certain date, and it doesn't codify the vast majority of ASRM guidelines that I think ASRM acts like the sperm banks are following. But sperm banks aren't members of ASRM. So guidelines are not enforceable, and they're also not members. So I just want to clarify a few of those things, and apologies if I'm getting passionate about some of these pieces, but this is a topic that genuinely I've been working on since January at least. And to claim process foul because people were included in many Zoom calls and phone calls and lots of emails in every version of the draft of the bill, which started out as a monstrous bill because it was the ASRM guidelines. I never got concrete feedback until today.
Okay. I know this is our last panel for opposition. Is there any final comment? If not, thank you all so much for Ms. Koupal.
I would just follow up, in terms of stakeholding. I called CCRM yesterday, which is the Colorado Center for Reproductive Medicine, which is the biggest fertility organization in the world that's in Lone Tree, and they had no idea. So, if there's a ton of licensing requirements that are listed in here that are completely separate with, protections that fall on the fertility clinics, I think the fertility clinics need the time to be able to look at this and see what they can comply with for this to be effective.
Thank you very much. Appreciate y'all coming. We'll call up our next panel. Well, let me say this. Is there anybody else in the audience or online that would like to testify in opposition to the bill before we stop with opposition? Seeing none, we'll call up the next panel of folks who are in support of the bill. I have John Weltman. Jonathan, is it Pollock? I have Jana Rupnow. Are any of these folks online? Okay, so who all do we have? We have John Weltman. Okay. Do we have a Jonathan Pollock? Okay. Do we have a Jana Rupnow? And then what about an Amanda Troxler? Okay, so we'll go ahead and begin with Jonathan Pollock. Thank you so much for joining us. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Coleman and committee members. My name is Jonathan Pollock, and I'm a donor-conceived person. I thank you for this opportunity to speak today in support of Senate Bill 22-224. Before learning I was donor-conceived at age 41 from a commercial DNA test, I know you've heard that before, I've been giving incorrect family health history to doctors. But even if I had known I was donor-conceived, sperm donor anonymity would have kept me from having accurate information. Like so many others, apart from being told that the donor was a healthy medical student, my parents knew nothing and never received updates about his health. When I finally tracked down and met my biological father, I learned that he donated sperm multiple times a week over a 7-year period. I found 16 half-siblings, but I likely have closer to 100, a number that isn't rare among donor-conceived people. That number makes me feel like a science experiment and a commodity. Plus, the risk of accidental incest within a group like mine is a very real concern. It's impossible to forge and maintain relationships with so many half-siblings. Knowing each other helps us to know ourselves, but we've all found each other later in life when we have careers, families, and live all over the country. The bill before you limits the number of families per donor. Each family could have as many children as they wish with the available supply of gametes, but no more than 10 families could use the same donor. Future Coloradans born of donor conception would no longer worry as much about accidental incest. A survey of 481 donor-conceived people in 2020 showed that 92% supported limiting the number of offspring per donor, thus eliminating large sibling groups of over 100. I urge you to vote in favor of SB 22-224 to create a better future for those conceived via third-party reproduction, as well as their social and biological parents. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I welcome the chance to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much. Next up, Jana Rupnow. Thank you for joining us. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
You're on mute.
Yep, you're still on mute.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I am Jana Rupnow. I am a licensed professional counselor. And I'll also say I'm an adult adoptee who was allowed access to my biological information at 18 by state laws established in the U.S. in the 1970s. I have been hired over the years by clinics, doctors, agencies, and intended parents to provide psychological services for donor conception. While I'd like to believe that all reproductive agencies self-regulate by following the ASRM guidelines, my experience over the last 12 years has proven otherwise. Some businesses are too influenced by profit to consider the future family's well-being. It's unfortunate to see a pattern of putting profit over guideline adherence. Agencies and clinics have attempted to manipulate or completely disregard my professional assessment to proceed with a disqualified candidate. Parents also hire me to counsel them after having a child through donor conception, feeling unsupported for some of the parenting challenges, like genetic loss, grief, parent-child attachment concerns, and potential identity confusion for their donor-conceived child. A child's confusion over being genetically different from their parents is described as genetic bewilderment, a common concept from the 1950s originating in the adoption field. This confusion can cause mental health difficulties. When secrets about donor conception are kept, late discoveries of this information cause identity breakdown and can create a psychological crisis, even leading to suicide ideology. Providing psychoeducation to parents about telling and the role of genetics in development will foster health development for the child. Unregulated gamete donation also results in overuse of a single person's sex cells, creating too many children. And parents and donor-conceived individuals have shared with me their fears of accidental incest and struggles with discovering a new sibling every 3 months. The psychological toll of assimilating new information about a recently discovering sibling has no clear ending for donor-conceived adults. The field of assisted reproduction began and operated in secrecy for decades, and under the veil of darkness, unethical practices took root.
Thank you. Please wrap up.
Thank you. Regulation is needed to undo this and a minimum standard of practice. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And now I'd like to call up Amanda Troxler. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You have 2 minutes.
My name is Amanda Troxler. I'm a fertility attorney. I've been practicing exclusively in this area of assisted reproduction for 11 years. I'm also a former egg donor. I donated to 6 families, and there are 8 children from my donations that I am aware of. I'm also a brand new first-time mother. I gave birth to my son last month, which is why I can't be there in person. I have a relationship with one of the families who received my eggs. They have 2 sons who are 5 and 3. It's wild watching them grow and each exhibit different traits that came from me. The family recently came to our house to meet our baby boy. I'm curious about how the relationship between the 3 boys who are biological brothers will develop over the years. I also think often about my offspring who are currently unknown to me. I hope that they are happy and healthy. I wonder if they're like me. My wish for them is that the world is fair to them and understanding. As a fertility attorney, I've dedicated my life to helping people navigate third-party reproduction. I know firsthand that donor conception creates so many amazing families. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to support donor-conceived people whose voices have so often been ignored. When I see the concerns and lived experiences of donor-conceived people being disregarded, I know that we need to take action now. That's not what I want from the 8 donor-conceived offspring who are navigating the world. The biggest improvement that can be made in the world of gamete donation is to improve transparency, and this bill provides reasonable mechanisms for doing that. I support this bill because reasonable limits must be placed on the number of donor-conceived siblings, because greater accountability is needed for agencies, banks, and clinics, and because people have a right to their own genetic information and their right to develop relationships with their genetic families. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think do we have John Weltman on yet or no? No? Okay. Well, that's all we have for this panel. We'll try to come back to Mr. Weltman. Any questions for this panel? Seeing none, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your testimony. We'll call up the next panel. I'd like to call up Lisa Stark-Hughes. Also, Gina Davis. Let me know if I need to slow down. Also, Cassandra Adams. And lastly, Shane Madsen Rich. Who are we missing? Let me know when you guys are done. Okay. So we can go ahead and begin with Lisa Stark-Hughes. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Hi, my name is Lisa Stark-Hughes, and I'm the owner of GS Moms, a full-service egg donation and surrogacy agency. We've been in business for over 11 years. I'm also an officer and education chair of the Society of Ethics in Egg Donation and Surrogacy, also known as SEEDS. Today I'm testifying in the capacity of GS Moms and egg donor agency. Every donor business, whether they're a donor bank, agency, or clinic, has a donor database. All of these entities currently have procedures in place to gather and update information on their donors. Currently, once a donor either chooses to no longer donate, has reached their maximum number of cycles, or ages out, their file is archived. This legislation merely asks us to continue sending a form email once every 3 years requesting updated medical and contact information for donors, so that if a child from that donation requests information, it's available. When doing a cost-benefit analysis, is sending a form email once every 3 years so difficult if it ensures that a donor-conceived person can receive this information if they request it? This bill also requires that donor recipient parents receive psychoeducational materials to better understand the unique lifelong impacts of donor conception. How can we as professionals say that a donor or recipient parent is making an informed choice without ensuring that they're educated on the impacts of their decisions that they're making for their children? And this includes both the recipient parents and the donor's children. Every study that has been done shows that telling the truth at a young age strengthens the families and results in better outcomes for the donor-conceived people and any other children the donor may have, which are half-siblings to the donor-conceived people. Propagating a lie and secrecy has shown only to be devastating, and recipients and donors must consider the impacts of these decisions they're making. The educational materials required in this bill are the barest minimum that can be done to unravel decades of infertility and donation being kept a family secret. This bill ensures that all parties enter into donation conception with the knowledge that upon reaching 18, the donor-conceived person will have the opportunity to identify the donor and possibly make contact if they wish. The bill gives a donor-conceived adult autonomy over this decision and ensures that transparency is the standard from the donor at the outset. At the end of this day, this bill
Thank you.
comes
Please
down
wrap
to
up.
educating parents and donors, sending out an email every 3 years, and keeping your records. I implore you to support this bill, and by doing so, you will show your support for responsible and ethical donation and strong family relationships.
Thank you for your testimony. Next up, Gina Davis, please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Senators, for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Gina Davis, and I'm the founder of Advocate Genetics, and I'm representing Advocate Genetics. I'm a genetic counselor who's worked in the fertility field for 20 years. I've also been an IVF patient, and following my successful cycle, my husband and I became known embryo donors. After this life-changing experience, I co-founded an embryo donation education and community platform with federal funding to do this work. I support this bill. And I support it because donor-conceived people and their families should be able to benefit from the evolution of personalized genomic medicine just like the rest of us, and with the means to explore their genetic identity in a way that makes sense to them. From a health perspective, as we chip away at the genetic and environmental cause of disease, the long-term communication of family medical updates has become indispensable to health management. It can often lead to testing, early diagnosis, and preventive management for at-risk individuals. Those who do not have access to this critical information can have their medical care significantly impacted. This includes most donor-conceived people because of decades of reliance on non-identified family donation. This bill will solve that problem by giving donor-conceived people access to the identities and medical histories of the donor used to conceive them, and requiring the industry to seek regular medical updates from donors. Even with guidance from professional societies intending to share better information with recipients, practice patterns vary significantly across the U.S. Given the importance of this information in safeguarding informed medical decision-making for donor-conceived people and their children, and acknowledging that anonymity is a false premise anyway with the advent of at-home DNA testing, state regulation can help establish thoughtful guidelines that will facilitate more appropriate communication of this information for donors, recipients, and donor-conceived people. And it really is more than that. The mental health needs of donor-conceived people are vitally important. This bill very appropriately requires that donors and recipient parents receive appropriate information about the interests and needs of donor-conceived people before engaging in donor conception. They should have access to medical updates through the years, and they should have access to identifying information in case it's ever decided by their children. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of this bill, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you for your testimony. Next up, Cassandra Adams, tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Chairman Coleman and members of the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee. My name is Cassandra Adams, and I am a donor-conceived person. My family is in Fort Collins, Colorado. I thank you for this opportunity to share my story and why I support Senate Bill 22-224. I was conceived and born in 1982 from anonymous sperm donation. I discovered the family secret through recreational DNA testing at the age of 35. I was of a completely different ethnic background than I was raised to believe. I'd received extremely inaccurate medical care throughout my life due to my false and unknown paternal medical history. And I'm fortunate to be alive, and not every donor-conceived person is that lucky. I was able to find my biological father within hours through my DNA matches. No one is anonymous any longer. My bio dad was very happy that we found him and agrees that if donors do not want to be found and are not willing to give updated medical history and information about themselves, then they should not donate. I now work in advocacy, and I am a moderator for the world's largest community for the entire donor conception constellation. I talk with thousands of parents and donors in addition to people like me. We see that parents come to our community with very little, if any, understanding of the gravity of the donor-conceived experience. They are not being prepared by clinics. Many are hearing about best practices for the very first time. We are asking for support for all parts of who we are. Donor-conceived people like me are rejected by our raising families for pursuing parts of our identities, which is a commonality that we share with many other marginalized groups. This is legislation to provide necessary protection, information, and documentation to us about our own bodies. The privilege of knowing where you come from makes it hard to understand, but our mental and physical health depends on you. We should not suffer because of the way we were conceived. We need equal rights and protection for all families, and that includes giving donor-conceived children who become adults open and transparent and ongoing access to our history and our own bodies, and enforcing best practices that will reduce the traumas and struggles of families. We are the experts. I have reclaimed myself by officially becoming a member of the Jewish tribe, by forming long overdue relationships with my new biological family, and now by sitting here to help reclaim it for all those who come after me. I want the autonomy and dignity regarding my own body, and I want to feel legally human.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And last that I called for this panel was Shane Madsen Rich. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Is it red or?
That gray button. Now it's green. There we go.
Okay. My name is Shane Madsen. I'm the General Counsel of the Independence Institute. But I'm here today as me. And this is very, very emotional. So, yeah, I'm going to let Rich go first. We're tag teaming.
My name is Rich Erlob. I am an adoptee, and I am the president of Adoption Search Resource Connection, also the newly formed Coalition for Truth and Transparency in Adoption. Our organization has worked on issues around truth and transparency for over 40 years in Colorado, and we've been thrilled to have the support of legends like Wellington Webb, Dottie Wham, Doug Linkhart, numerous committee chairs, and people who are still in the legislature today. We're here not because I'm an expert on donor conception, but to try to take it back up to a little bit higher level and some of the principles involved here. I'm so thankful to the Senator for sponsoring this bill, in particular because it is the first bill that is representing the voices of those created through assisted reproduction. We've heard a lot from industry people who say they support this, and yet, interestingly, have not pushed bills like this yet. When I was in college, I heard a spiritual leader say that life's 3 biggest questions are, where did I come from, why am I here, and where am I going? With that, the answer to number 1, 2, and 3 are a lot more difficult. In addition to that, one thing that we came to realize in working toward records access for adult adoptees is that despite all the love that's created in families, despite all the goodness that comes out of adoption, it's also an economic system. And in that system, we are products. This bill would shift the focus to hear the voice of the products for the first time. Please vote yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll get my tears away. I'm a former foster child. I'm an adult adoptee. I've been active probably for 20 years with Rich in opening adoption records and helping foster youth. You've got a big softie on this committee with Senator Sonnenberg. Yeah, okay. I'm going to tell the story. When he sponsored one of the adoption bills, a constituent of his who was a birth mother met her son at the signing ceremony. So it was pretty darn good. Anyway, what I really want, Senator Fenberg, for you to listen as we've gone through our struggles with adoption and foster youth is what we heard at every single committee hearing was, you're going too fast, this is dangerous, we need a perfect bill. But the truth is, transparency is worth it. It's a little messy, but it works out. So don't go slow.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony. Any questions for this panel? I know there's folks that are we have that also want to testify, but any questions for this panel? Senator Sonnenberg.
Just one comment now that the rest of these people didn't think I had a heart, and you're killing me, Shane.
That $100 bill you offered me didn't work.
No, that's all good. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you. We do believe Senator Sonnenberg has a heart, so it's all good. Thank you for coming to testify. I really appreciate you all. I'm going to call up this next panel, and it's actually one more person on the list that was provided.
I don't think we heard from
Yeah, I didn't call yet.
Oh,
What's your name, please?
Aaron Jackson.
Okay, cool. So you're ready.
Here, so
you're ready. You're ready. So Aaron Jackson is next on the panel, which is perfect. And then I actually have a few more folks signed up to testify in support of the bill. So let's see. Do we have a Richard Erlab? Oh, that was you, Richard. Okay, got it. All right, let's see. What about, Jillian Phillips? I think we already heard from Romina Slossberg. Okay. And I guess that was it. So that being said, is there anybody else? Oh, yeah. Right.
John Weltman.
John Weltman. Okay, so we have John Weltman and we have Aaron Jackson. Anyone else, either in the audience or online, that would like to sign up and testify if they hadn't already done so? I want to make sure that we give you a chance to speak in support of the bill. If not, we'll go ahead and have Mr. Weltman. Thank you for joining us. We're glad you were able to connect. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
My name is John Weltman. I'm a gay father through surrogacy and egg donation. I'm an attorney, and I started Circle Surrogacy and Egg Donation in 1995, which is now the largest agency in the United States. I represent myself, I guess Circle. My kids began asking about their genetic roots at 7 and 8, and knowing their genetic makeup has been very important to them in terms of dispelling the mystery of how they came to be and keeping them apprised of discovered changes in their genetic makeup. I've always considered known donation the single most important choice a parent needing donation can make. It not only dispels the mystery of their child's origin, but it can also be life-saving. I had a sister who was diagnosed with breast cancer at 45 and learned she had the BRCA2 gene, which gave her a 50% chance of breast cancer and a 25% chance of ovarian cancer. She died at 52 when her son was 8 years old. Had she been a donor in her 20s, she would have said no family history of the disease, but she was a walking time bomb. As a result of her discovery, my younger sister tested positive for BRCA2 and had her ovaries and breasts removed after having children. Those children are now near 11 and 12 and still have their mother remains healthy. This bill's requirement for ongoing medical updates and record retention could save lives. I've always offered known donation at Circle. When we began, we're the only agency to do so. Now, 27 years later, as one of the 5 board members for SEEDS, which sets ethical standards for egg donor and surrogacy agencies, I can say that most of the over 300 agency members offer known donation, and nearly all prefer at least knowable donation. Today, instead of 30 egg donors, we offer over 1,000 donors, 90% of whom agree to be known by age 18, and 95% of our clients want a knowable donor. Almost every client who's done anonymous donation has returned by the time their child was 7 to seek contact with their donor on behalf of their child. Moreover, today, the likelihood that a donor can remain anonymous is nearly zero. We had one woman discovering she was a donor child discover 17 that her donor parent in one social media, DNA testing, and facial recognition.
Thank you. Please wrap up.
Dozens of countries have banned anonymous donation. It's time the states in this country followed suit. This bill's open ID at 18 requirement is the very least we can do.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Weltman. And last but not least, Ms. Jackson, thank you for joining us. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You'll have 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Coleman and committee members. My name is Aaron Jackson. I'm the founder of We Are Donor Conceived and president of the U.S. Donor Conceived Council. I'm here to share my support for SB 224. 7 years ago, I discovered my dad is not my biological father. This information shattered my identity and changed my life forever. I immediately took a DNA test because I realized that half of my medical history was a mystery. When I saw a half-brother in my DNA relatives list, my heart grew 3 sizes. Since then, I have connected with 6 more siblings, and I assume I have many, many more. In 2016, I founded an online community for donor-conceived people called We Are Donor Conceived. In the past 6 years, I have listened to the voices of thousands of donor-conceived people around the world. I am so excited to be here because this is the first bill in the nation to acknowledge the rights, needs, and interests of donor-conceived people. Something you need to know about us is that we want the opportunity to know the identity of the person that contributed half of our DNA. In my case, I urgently needed to know, and it was unacceptable to me that this information was kept secret because of how I was conceived. In 2020, I conducted a survey of donor-conceived people that received nearly 500 responses. The vast majority believe that all donor-conceived people should have the option to know the donor's identity and health history, because it's our information too. This bill would accomplish that and so much more. Today, you have heard personal testimonies from donor-conceived people, recipient parents, and donors, all in favor of the changes that will be made by this bill. You have also heard from renowned experts and industry professionals who support it. I urge you to support SB 224. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I do see that we have one more person who I believe is signed up in support. Is it Jillian Phillips? Thank you for joining us. Please tell us your name, who you represent, and begin your testimony. You will have 2 minutes.
Hello, thank you, Chairman Coleman and committees of the State Veterans and Military Committee. My name is Jillian Phillips, and I am here to encourage your support of Senate Bill 22224. This issue is important to me because as a donor-conceived person, I have faced many issues as a direct result, including not having a family medical history. I was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition in 2019, almost a decade after my symptoms began. Having no family medical history led to a delay in diagnosis and treatment. I have had 6 surgeries in the last 2 years. All were directly related to this condition. Since finding my biological father, I've learned that I'm at risk for early cardiac death. My biological aunt and biological grandfather both passed away young due to having these health issues. Had I not found my biological father, I would have never learned that I needed to be under the close care of a cardiologist. Meeting my biological father literally could have saved my life. So I urge you to support Senate Bill 22224, which recognizes the importance of a family medical history to the health of donor-conceived people. It would require banks and clinics to maintain the donor's medical records and obtain regular updates that donor-conceived people can request. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. Phillips. Questions for our panel, Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Ms. Jackson,
Yes.
I am amazed at all the work you've done. Over 500 responses.
Yeah, 491. I'm like, come on.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair will kind of recognize you when you can respond back, just to keep
Sure.
our process.
Excitement.
I know you are excited. I was excited when I heard your testimony. So we heard previously another witness say that it's rare that people find a whole bunch of family members, and that it's so rare that it's on the cover of People magazine. I think I heard someone say. It sounds from what you just told us, it's not that rare. And I've finally had a chance to look over some of the emails here, and it looks like this is happening a lot, where you find out you're related to a whole bunch of people. And can you just give me a little bit more about that, and what was that like? And it sounds like if you've talked to 500 people, it's not as rare as one person is telling us.
Ms. Jackson.
Yeah, the survey was 500 people responded, and I think something like 79% had found at least one donor sibling, and a smaller percentage had found a large amount. But there are definitely people I know who have like 50 plus confirmed, and that's just confirmed through DNA. That's not total. In my situation, there's an 8-year age gap between the youngest and oldest donor sibling. And from what I know, our biological father was really taking advantage of that easy tax-free income for all of those years. So just doing the math, I assume I have 100 siblings, but it could be 300. 100 is something I can sort of mentally process in a way. But this definitely does make me feel, like a commodity, a science experiment. It doesn't make me feel great about being conceived this way. And on one hand, it's exciting to think that I could be meeting a new sibling every couple of months, and I do. They pop up. But every time one of them pops up, there's also this sadness that comes with it, because you're like, I'm so glad to know you, but we already missed out on so much. You know, I'm in my 40s. I missed their weddings. I missed their kids being born. So there is like this grief that comes with the reunion as well.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate you all. That is all we have time to testify. We've already asked if there's any additional testimony, and that being said, witness testimony phase is closed. To the amendment phase, I know that we do have one amendment. Allow our sponsor to get back to the table. And as he is back to the table, Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will go ahead and move L001 to Senate Bill 224.
It's a proper motion. Mr. President, would you like to tell us about L001?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee. L001 is largely fixing some grammatical or typos. It does remove references to assisted reproductive technology, which was just kind of left over from a previous draft. And so it removes that and replaces it with assisted reproduction. I think that is largely, it takes out a couple of words that were just unnecessary, but it's not substantive to the policy itself.
Any questions or opposition to L001? Seeing none, L001 is adopted. Any other amendment sponsor? Committee, seeing none, amendment phase is closed. Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move Senate Bill 224 as amended to the Appropriations Committee.
That is a proper motion. Any final wrap-up? Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee, for being patient throughout that, but also for paying such close attention. I know this is not an issue that you ran for office to work on, but here we are in the State Veterans Military Affairs Committee, where all random things come, and that was inappropriate, Mindy. What I want to say is, look, this is an issue that I care deeply about, that is incredibly personal for so many people. There are professionals that work in this field that, frankly, disagree on this bill. And I think that's, I get it. I think that's fine. I think that's normal. And I think at the end of the day, you know, a couple of things I just want to mention in my wrap up. Number one is I hear the concerns that this feels rushed. And in the scheme of the how long some of these practices have been happening, it is rushed. It's happening at the very last, you know, these practices generally have been happening for decades. And now we see people like Aaron, who is a grown adult, a professional, and an advocate in their own right. So for some folks, it may seem fast, like things are changing overnight. For so many people, like Aaron, like Tyler, like so many of the other people that were here today, this is not fast. This is slow. And these are, frankly, the practices that have been recommended for several years now by mental health practices, by doctors, by ASRM. And so, yes, it probably does feel fast to some people who have been involved in this industry and feel like the way things are working might not be perfect and some changes need to happen, but that this is too much too soon. But I think for so many of the impacted people, frankly, we are on the cusp of even knowing who is impacted because it wasn't possible to know before. This is a relatively new thing. Is this bill the answer? I don't know. It is a answer, and I am approaching it to make sure we are doing no harm, and I think there are still some disagreements on that. That is a conversation I welcome having over the coming days. We only have, 15 days left in session, but that is a lifetime at the end of session. I welcome the conversations, the feedback, the criticisms from here on out. I genuinely look, I ran, I was one of the Senate sponsors for the fertility coverage bill. A very different issue in many ways. It's an insurance issue at the end of the day. But the last thing I would want to do is negatively impact families that are trying to conceive and have children. I want everybody who is interested to experience the pain and suffering of being woken up at 4 a.m. by their daughter like I was this morning just because she was ready to watch a video. Having a family is obviously an incredibly special thing, and I think everybody should do it. And this is key and critical to how some people start a family. And I don't want to take that away from anybody. For various reasons, I think this bill does not do that. I think it helps the industry get nudged to start making the changes that I think many of them know needs to happen. We heard from most of the folks who oppose the bill today, and I do deeply respect the work they do and their opinions that they've brought to this committee today. I think almost every single one of them said, I don't support the bill, but I do support the rights of donor-conceived people. It may not seem like it to some people, but I think that alone is a big deal to even say those words, because it wasn't part of the conversation for decades. I think every individual that's involved in third-party reproduction needs to be respected. Their privacy needs to be respected. They need to be fully informed about what they are doing. And for years, that didn't really include the child, who eventually becomes an Aaron or a Tyler. And I think this bill starts moving things in that direction. I'm absolutely open to conversations on how to make sure it is as narrowly tailored as I intend, and that it doesn't have negative impacts, whether that's putting some guardrails on the rulemaking, talking about when the family limitation actually comes into play, how and if it impacts embryos. If there are tweaks to the definition, I'm open to that. At the end of the day, what I will stand firm on is that we do something that is meaningful for the people who have been conceived in this manner, who often have been left out of the conversation. That's my ask. And I think this bill does that. But I welcome other ideas to figure out how to continue that and make sure we're meeting that goal. So to everybody who supported, who oppose, or who just aren't sure, I hope and I will commit the time, more Zooms, more calls, meetings, whatever it is. I will accept red lines of the bill and figure out what we need to do. I'm committed to doing that. Maybe Jane disagrees with the red line comment, but I welcome the conversation and genuinely want feedback to make sure that this is a good bill for Colorado. And I won't be shy about it. I hope that we pass something we can be proud of and that gets adopted in every state in this country. And I want to do it right, and I want it to be done in a way that brings families along, that brings the industry along, and brings everybody who's involved in this process along in a way that can be implemented and actually does improve the outcomes for families, protects the rights of people, and advances protections for donor-conceived people and their families. So thank you, committee, for your attention this afternoon. It means a lot to me for all of you to be engaged and be working through this with me. And I ask for an aye vote from the committee today.
Thank you, Mr. President. Seeing no further discussion, Ms. Wallace, please call the roll.
Senator Hansen?
Aye.
Senator Simpson?
Aye.
Senator Sonnenberg?
Aye.
Senator Hoescth-Lewis?
Aye.
Mr. Chair.
Aye. Congratulations. 224 passes unanimously. And you're on your way to the Appropriations Committee.